Good afternoon. It was so wonderful to see so many of you last Shabbat in Shul and on the streets of Lakeview, at the dessert hop, in the playgrounds of the neighborhood with your children. It's really, really encouraging. It's really inspiring that so many of you were able to come to Shul. And I hope that in the coming weeks, as vaccinations continue to spread, as the health situation in our region continues to improve, that more and more of you will take advantage of the opportunities that are newly available to us to come together and to pray together and to learn together and to be together. It really is, and it was personally very inspiring, and I hope to see more of you this Shabbat and next Shabbat and the weeks to come. This Shabbat, we complete Sefer Vayikra with the Parshiot, the double portions of Behar-Behukotai, and the first of those double portions, Behar, contains many of the mitzvot that delineate and shape and describe Jewish economic life. The mitzvot of Shemitah, that calls for the cessation of agricultural labor every 7 years and the cancellation of debts every 7 years. The mitzvah of Yovel, that calls for the redistribution of land as the primary means of production every 50 years, and the freeing of indentured servants at that time. These mitzvot, along with others, really dramatically shape economic life in a Jewish society, but only if it's an entirely Jewish society that can take control over its own economic life and is then committed to shaping that economic life in line with the spirit of the Torah and the values of the Torah. I have on the source sheet a series of passages that really speak to this, to what it means to have Jewish economic life, to have a fuller, richer sense of what it means to live amongst Jews and to embody not just the rules of the Torah and the spirit of the Torah in all of our interactions with one another. The first two passages are from a writer known as the Admor Chalutz, the pioneer Rebbe, Rabbi Sheahu Shapiro, who was from a very distinguished Hasidic family. His brother was the Piseshner Rebbe Zatzal, the famous Hasidic rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto. Rabbi Sheahu Shapiro made his way to Eretz Yisrael before the war and was enamored of the socialist ethos of the Zionist pioneers, and felt that the Jewish return to Eretz Yisrael had to mean something more, had to be about redemption and renewal, and that had to entail a new form of economic life that was free of oppression. The first passage, he writes that we have to create a lifestyle here which is not just merely legal, but actually is holy and is in fulfillment of the demand, V'asita yashar v'tov b'nei Hashem. We're really striving to do right and good in the eyes of God beyond the basic floor set down by the mitzvot of the Torah. And clearly, he says, Judaism is against the notion of private property, because the Mishnah explicitly says that the ideology of shali shali v'shalcha shalcha, what's mine is mine and yours is yours, which should be a very familiar ideology to all of us, because we're steeped in that ideology. We're surrounded by that ideology, the ideology of private property. The Mishnah says that's midat sdom. That's a sodomite, wicked way of living in the world. That's a way of living that leads to destruction. Life isn't sustainable with that ideology, and that's codified in the Mishnah, at least as a Yeshamim, as an opinion that the sanctification of private property is a sodomite evil. And so the Torah is not about private property. And the mitzvot of Parshat Behar really make clear that the types of limits on property ownership and the way in which property is curtailed and shared and redistributed are in the spirit of creating a certain type of communal solidarity around mitzvah observance, around not allowing the poor to become oppressed, not allowing the rich to take advantage of their wealth to assert power over the poor. And that's a very special and very distinct form of economic life. He has a very passage which I love, where he reminds us of when the prophet Natan confronts David HaMelech, confronts King David, and he wants to say, David, you did something really bad by stealing the wife of Uriah, etc., etc. What's the mashal? What's the analogy, the parable that Natan uses? He says there was a rich man who had many sheep, and there was a poor man who lived next door who only had one sheep who he really cared about, and the rich man stole the poor man's sheep. And what is David is outraged, okay? He said they should kill that wealthy man. How dare he? He used his wealth to assert his power over his poor neighbor. That's outrageous. David is outraged by the metaphor, by the parable. And And Rav Shapiro writes, can one even imagine anyone today who would declare death sentence on one who steals the sheep of a poor man? Of course, we know full well the seriousness of the prohibitions against stealing, tormenting the prohibition of ona'ah, spreading gossip, slander, baseless hatred, embarrassing another in public. Of course, there are interpersonal mitzvot that exist. We acknowledge them, but violating these prohibitions no longer arouses within us the same agitation as is caused by the violation of other prohibitions, such as eating forbidden foods. Okay, we define people as being from or not from. We define people and characterize people as being Orthodox or not Orthodox based on, how they daven or what they do on Shabbos. But these very important mitzvot about oppression, right? About tormenting, about causing affliction to another with one's speech or with embarrassment, etc., these are not don't rise, okay, to the level that somebody would say he's not a frum person, okay, it's not a member in good standing of the Orthodox community. A man who holds on to the wages of his employee or who spreads gossip is indeed considered to be not quite right. Okay, not a tzaddik. He's his employees have to sue him to get paid, but he's not going to be considered as one who is secular or irreligious, even though these prohibitions are not lighter than others. Then he writes, this situation is the outcome of the long exile. It's the exile that makes us prioritize ritual mitzvot and say these are the ones that determine whether or not somebody's from or not. These are the mitzvot that determine whether or not you're going to, get mafter yonah. We're going to honor you in the synagogue as a representative of the community. It's ritual mitzvot rather than interpersonal ethical mitzvot, or certainly the economic mitzvot that can define a community. This is exile. This is galus. And Rav Shapiro was hoping for that the return to Eretz Yisrael would entail a return to a more heightened ethical sensitivity and a fuller embrace of the Torah, not just the ritual mitzvot of the Torah, but the interpersonal and the economic mitzvot of the Torah. So the Veitzek hoped for the same thing. In a speech he gave shortly after the establishment state of Israel, he describes the shrinking of the Shekhinah, as it were, the withdrawal of the Shekhinah. God's presence itself is removed from Jewish life because we're not able to live out the Torah fully, okay? The Torah becomes confined to a narrow set of ritual mitzvot. He writes, unfortunately, one of the cardinal misunderstandings in modern Jewish history was the identification of the Jewish working class of the rabbis with the organized European clergy in general. As the workers generally fought for economic and political equality, the church supported the rulers and the powerful. Jewish revolutionaries condemned the Jewish Torah for the sins of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. The hatred for Torah Judaism still reverberates today. Okay, writing in the 40s, I think, right? He's saying that there's this alienation between the working class and the rabbinic class and rabbis more broadly, because working people had to fight their oppression, not just against the bosses, not just against the aristocracy, but against the church hierarchy that was aligned with the aristocracy against their interests. And he says, this mistake, which cost us a great deal, is a result of the shrinking of the Shekhinah in exile. As it were, God's presence is confined in exile. The Jewish Choshen Mishpat, the laws governing economic life, has never been on the side of the employer and the powerful. The Torah of you shall not oppress a widow and orphan, you will not oppress him, you shall pay him his wages on that day, and for to me the children of Israel are servants, not servants to them other people, has never been opportunistic. It's always defended the helpless and the desolate, and in this sense these rules are more advanced than many modern labor societies, okay? But what happens? We're not able to live out a full economic life according to the spirit of the Torah. The rules of Choshen Mishpat, which protect the working classes, are abandoned in favor of ritual mitzvot. The Torah is just a book of rules about what to eat and when and how, and therefore the working classes are alienated from the Torah itself. This is the Torah in exile. And so the Veitzek hoped the very earliest days of the state of Israel that it could represent this redemption of the Shekhinah, that God's presence could come back into our community more fully, and that we could return to a fuller Jewish economic life. I think that vision was a really beautiful one. I think it has by and large not been not been pursued. That vision has not been pursued by and large, even though it inspired many thousands a generation or two ago. But I think the vision is still relevant and still remains for someone to pick it up and to try to deploy it. Shabbat Shalom. I hope to see you all in shul or on the streets or on a Zoom class or on a phone call. All right, take care, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.